Hashem. This week's parsha is a double portion, Tazria, Mitzora, and also on Shabbos, it's also going to be Rosh Chodesh. So what I like to do is start by talking about the Isha Yoledes, the woman who gives birth. And then after that, if we have time, we'll get to, which I don't know that we will, we'll get to, God willing, Bezras Hashem Yisbarach, the discussion of the tzaras, the mitzora. A lot of people think that it's connected to the sin of Lashon Hara, but that's actually just one of many possible sins, or several possible sins that the Gemara and Erechim lists. And it's hard to imagine that it's only from the sin of Lashon Hara, bad talk, because Gemara has a scenario where a baby has this tzarat, and a baby obviously can't speak, a newborn baby, talking about bris, if you can do the circumcision on if that part of the body has tzaras, because you're not allowed to cut off the tzarat. You have to go to the Kohen. So anyway, that's the whole question. But let's just first look at the first few verses of this week's portion. Let's read it to review where we are, and then the first 8 verses, and then after that we can talk about, explain it, say the Rashi, say some of the rabbinic commentaries on it, and then and say some of the Hasidic interpretation, and then if we have time, get to Tzara. So it says, chapter 12, verse 1, Daber Hashem al Moshe. We're going to review the passage so we understand, generally speaking, what it is. Daber b'nei Yisrael more. So God says to Moshe, speak to the children of Israel. Isha ki Tazria, if a woman will conceive, v'yolda zachar, and she'll give birth to a male. V'tama shivas yamim. So if she gives birth to a male, then she will be ritually impure for 7 days. Himei nidas divosa titma, like the days of a nida woman. Divosa can either mean, Rashi has 2 explanations, either in her flow or in her illness, she'll become ritually impure. In any event, the Torah is teaching us the law that if a woman gives birth to a male, she is ritually impure for 7 days. Ubayom hashmini, and on the 8th day, yimol basar so. Then on the 8th day, he should circumcise the flesh of his foreskin. Meaning to say that we were talking about the woman being ritually impure, but come along the 8th day, that has nothing to do with the woman. The obligation to circumcise a son or yourself, if nobody circumcised you, is not on the mother. The mother does not have this command. And it's an obligation on the father. Or on the person himself if his father doesn't do it. In fact, the Jerusalem Talmud says from here, from these words, the Jerusalem Talmud says from here, Mikan sha'av mitzuva beno lamur. From here we see that the father is commanded to circumcise, not the mother. In fact, in my rabbinate, I can understand why, because I met some mothers who were too afraid. The fathers usually don't have the fear, but the mothers are very shaken up at the bris. It's just too hard for them to see. They leave the room or they protest. I've seen that a few times, but I've never seen the father object. So maybe this is why the Torah doesn't command the mother to do it, because maybe it's too hard of a commandment on the mother, just too hard. The Babylonian Talmud has a different source for the idea that the mitzvah of a circumcision is on the father. And they learned out from the fact that by Abram it says, Vayamo Avraham, the Babylonian Talmud in Kedushin 29a, learns out from the fact that it says, and Abraham circumcised Isaac his son, like God had commanded him. Vayamo Avram et Yitzchak beno kasher tziva ito Elokim. And so here it's even more explicit that God commanded him to circumcise his son. It's a commandment on Abraham, and so it's a commandment on all the fathers. And here, and it's kind of opaque. It doesn't say anything about who the commandment is, that it's specifically on the father. So it's not necessarily clear. So that's why the Babylonian Talmud cites the verse from Genesis. But the Jerusalem Talmud brings this verse because it says because this verse takes place after the giving of the Torah at Sinai, and so therefore it's more likely to say that that this was the source of the commandment, because the Torah doesn't like to cite the law, the Talmud doesn't like to cite as pre-Sinaitic verses as sources for the commandment. Okay. Anyway, that was a tangent. The Talmud continues. The Torah continues. For 33 days, she should sit. She'll sit in her pure blood. She's not allowed to touch anything sacred. So this is the law that for the next 33 days, she sits in what's pure blood, meaning to say she in all likelihood will have blood emanating from her body over the next 33 days. But that blood, unlike menstrual blood, which the rabbis say is tameh, is ritually impure, and unlike the blood for the 7 days after she gives birth, which the rabbi says is ritually impure, the blood for the next 33 days after she gives birth to a male is considered pure blood, demei tahara, pure blood, dam tohar. And so biblically speaking, it is not ritually impure. Biblically speaking, she's allowed to, anything she touches does not become ritually impure. She remains tahor. And so this is an irony that the first 7 days it's tameh, but the next 33 days it's tahor. But that's only biblically speaking. When the rabbis get involved, rabbis are going to prohibit everything, but it's only prohibited rabbinically. And this is what's called dam tohar, pure blood. But that's only for a male. One of the mysteries is that it's different from female. If she'll give birth to a girl, then it's doubled. Everything is doubled. And the Torah does not explain why. The Torah does not explain why, if it's a girl, it's doubled. Why? The Torah doesn't tell us, but it just says she's ritually impure, v'tamash shivuayim. She's ritually impure for 2 weeks, and for 66 days, she will then be ritually pure. So everything for the male is doubled. Everything for the female is doubled. Hold on, before we take a question, I just want to finish the next 2 verses so we can get the full picture of this passage. So again, the first 33 days, the 33 days for a male birth, it's dam tohar, it's pure blood. And for female, it's 2 weeks of ritually impure, and then 66 days of ritually pure blood. So during those 66 days, she theoretically is allowed to touch her husband, allowed to live with her husband. When those pure days are completed, so during those 33 days and during those 66 days, she's still not allowed to touch b'chol kodesh lo tiga, meaning to say she's not allowed to touch truma, she's not allowed to go and eat sacred food. And she's what's called tevulas yom aruch. It's like somebody who is tameh and goes to the mikvah, they can't eat the sacred food of the temple until nightfall. Her nightfall that she's waiting for is either 33 days or 66 days. But she still can't go in. What does she need after immersing at the end of those 33 days or 66 days? She's what's called mechusar kippurim. She's lacking atonement. There's 4 who are lacking atonement. Arba mechusar kippurim means to say that even though they've gone through the process of waiting the number of days, of immersing in the mikvah, they still can't enter into the temple. They still can't enter into the temple until such time as she brings a korban. As it states, when she finishes her days of purity, for a son or a daughter, then she has to bring an offering. What is her offering? She brings a lamb under a year old, or a sheep under a year old for an olah, or she would bring a turtle dove or a pigeon as a sin offering. So she brings two animals, a sheep and a bird, and she brings it to the entrance to the tent of the Kohen, and she brings it, and that's how she is purified. She's purified. But one last thought to tell us, because there's a lot of laws here, and I know once we get into the questions, deeper analysis, we're not going to get the basic laws. But this is one of the three karbanos that are what's called a variable offering, an ola v'yored, meaning to say there are three sacrifices where if you can't afford it, you get to give less. Today's tax day. There's a different tax rate. Some people are taxed at whatever, 40%. There's 15%, there's 20%, depending on how much money you have. So this is also an example where the Torah says, give a different korban, give a different offering if you're poor than if you're wealthy. Let's say she can't afford a sheep. She just gave birth. It's expensive. Who knows what it costs today? Let's say a birth costs, let's say $5,000. Back then it was the equivalent. I'm sure the prices are, midatis, mitanit, the same idea. Expensive to give birth now. It's probably expensive then. She has to she can't go into the temple until she brings an offering. She doesn't have the $200 to buy a sheep. So what does she do? And if she can't afford the lamb, so what should she do? She takes two birds. If she can't afford it, she brings two birds, one for an olah, one for a chatas, an olah offering and a sin offering, and then she'll achieve atonement. It's a whole question. Why is she bringing a sin offering? What sin did she commit? What sin did she even commit? So, and anyway, I'll review this in a moment. I'll go over and review it again, but these are the verses. But let's hear, there's a question here before we get into Rashi and the commentaries. Question is this discrimination? Why are we talking about impurity? It's just blood. So let's take a step back and say a lot of these laws are very hard for us to relate to today. We don't live in a world of ritual purity and impurity. That's not how we define ourselves spiritually anymore. It's most overwhelming, like 99% of men in the Jewish community very rarely go to mikvah. It's only like the Hasidic community or the ultra-Orthodox who go. And even the women, they are only going, rarely, like once a month, but that's only during childbearing years, etc. So that's the only part of purity and impurity that's even still relevant. For the ancient world, the religious spiritual life was defined by ritual purity and impurity. And how could you become tamei? You could become tamei, ritually impure, if something there was tumah that came out of your body. For a man, it was an emission of seed that would make him ritually impure, or some other flow from his body. Let's say some gonorrheal type flow. And for a woman, what made her ritually impure was something that flowed from her body, like, for example, the menstrual blood. In addition to that, the other ways you could become impure was by touching a dead body, or by touching even someone who touched a dead body, or by touching a carcass of an animal, or of a rodent, a creepy crawly creature. So these are the ways in which people could become ritually impure. And if you became impure, then it was everything had to be done with extreme intentionality, because you can mess up everybody's food or the sacred food, or you can go into the wrong place. And the question is, like, today, we explain our world today through science. That's the way most of people understand their world. We understand through science, through germs, through bacteria. That's the way most people explain our world. But in the ancient world, science was not trustworthy, because science was a lot of times just completely wrong. So the way people in the ancient world made sense of things was different, right? They viewed things which were a lot of times transmitting diseases like saliva or something that comes out of your body, and they viewed it with great suspicion. So today we have hazardous waste that comes out of your body in a hospital, and we put it away, like a big red container. If you've ever, had to see a hospital, they have to be very careful. So they were very careful with anything that came out of your body. But today we call it, infection, possibly. They knew enough to understand that it was dangerous. They didn't understand the science, but what they did understand far better than us is that science can't be separated from spirituality, and that on a spiritual level, there also needed to be some healing done. So, without going into the details of every specific law, when a person becomes tamei, what they're really saying is that you need a spiritual healing in order to become pure, in order to become complete again. And let's say, for example, the next passage that's discussed in the portion is the person who has the skin disease called sarat, the skin disease called leprosy. It's clear from the text that this was a person who had something growing on their body, something which caused them to be ostracized from the community. And as a consequence, they were wandering around and they shout out to people, "Stay away from me. I have something." Now, even in the modern period, people are afraid of lepers. I don't know, people are, even in the 20th century, nobody would want to touch. People look differently, even with our quote unquote enlightened approach. People are intimidated when people look differently. They have these diseases. So whenever anybody's body does something which is atypical, there's this concern of how to deal with it, in a safe manner, and also how to deal with it in a way that's constructive, that brings the person closer to society and allows the person to heal again. So we could argue whether or not a woman who has her typical flow or a woman who gives birth needs this, but the reality is that for much of human history, a woman who had a flow or a woman who gave birth was viewed as having gone through a tremendous trauma, and that person needed to be healed. Even if they didn't need a physical healing, they needed a spiritual healing. And so what our portion here is teaching us is that there is a spiritual healing process for a woman after she gave birth, which we no longer have today. We no longer have a spiritual healing process for a woman after she gives birth. And maybe we should. I mean, there's a lot of women who suffer from depression after they give birth, or they suffer physically after they give birth, and there's a long recovery. Even though a woman is released from the hospital, oftentimes now the next day, it's not by any means the case that she's physically okay at that point. She has a long recovery, even though she's walking around after 2 weeks and caring for the baby and going back to work after 6 weeks on maternity leave is over. Her recovery time after giving birth can take easily months and months, if not more. And it's a huge process. So you could look at this ritual as the first known maternity leave in human history. The woman is being told, if you give birth to a male, don't even come near the temple. Don't even come near the temple. You don't have to go to any bar mitzvahs. You don't have to go to any holiday parties. You stay in your home. You stay in your home for the next 40 days or 80 days. That's basically a 3-month maternity leave. That's more than the federal government gives you even. So the basic idea is that this was a way that the Torah is giving for a woman to heal. So rather than focus on the fact that she is ritually impure, I want to suggest we focus on the fact that this is a healing process, and she definitely needs the healing. She definitely needs the healing. There's no woman who gives birth who doesn't need a healing. And lots of times our society today doesn't recognize that, but the reality is that the Torah recognized it. That she needed a physical healing and a spiritual healing. And one of the big mysteries here is, why is she bringing a sin offering? What did she do wrong? And the Talmud discusses it. But the truth is, maybe it's just she's spiritually out of balance. Even after a woman gives birth, I mean, it's not necessarily politically correct to say this, but she's not herself. She's not where she was before she was pregnant. Her hormones are out of balance. So the sin offering is really about becoming whole again, helping her along this process, and it's something that's needed. Hold on 1 second. We have a question on the floor. Hold on. Okay, so now what I'd like to resume with is looking at some of the Hasidic explanations of this. Um, but before we do that, let me just summarize because we read it quickly, and I want to make sure that everybody understands what's going on here. So take a step back. A woman who has her normal, typical menstrual cycle is tamei for 7 days. And biblically speaking, after those 7 days, she could go to the mikvah and be purified and basically resume her life without transmitting ritual impurity. Rabbinically, we say she has to wait from the end of the flow, which 7 clean days. So rabbinically speaking, a woman who has seen her menstrual flow has to wait a minimum of 12 days. But here we're talking about not the typical menstrual flow, we're talking about the blood of giving birth. And rabbis say there's no blood, there's no birthing without blood. That's what the rabbis say. I don't know if it's accurate. That's what they say. And it doesn't matter if they're right or not. They make the law. So if she gives birth to a boy, she's tamei for 7 days. If she gives birth to a girl, she's tamei for 14 days. That means during those 7 days or 14 days, she cannot touch her husband. She can't touch any sacred food. But then for the next 33 days or the next 66 days, for a boy, the blood she has is ritually pure, and she's no longer tamei. She has gone to the mikveh after 7 days, or after 2 weeks for a girl. But then she's still bleeding. But that blood is not considered tamei. That blood is pure blood, and it doesn't mean like a pure blood, like you're a pure blood, you have great ancestry. It just means that blood is not disqualifying or contaminating, but it's limited because she still cannot enter the temple and she still cannot eat the sacred food. For that, she's going to need a korban. She needs to bring an offering. And those are the korbanos. This offering is called a variable offering, an ola v'ori. It depends upon how much she can afford. If she can afford it, she brings a sheep and a bird. If she can't afford it, she brings the 2 birds, and then she is purified from the source. So this is the law, Zos Torah Sayoedis. This is the law of the woman who has given birth. So obviously there's a lot to talk about here, which is why the difference between a boy and a girl. Like, where does that even come from? What's the purpose of it? Why is she bringing a sin offering? Why is this one a case of a korban that is variable? It's normally not the case. Let's say if you eat forbidden food and you have to bring a korban, you don't get to bring less of a korban if you can't afford it. But here we have this as a variable, and also we have the mitzvah of bris. Like, why is that thrown in here at all? It seems like that's not necessarily the most relevant space to talk about it. So anyway, these are some of the laws of this passage, and now let's look at some of the Hasidic insights into this passage. So this is the law of the Yoledis, of the woman who gives birth. I mentioned before that we have a question by the bris that also relates to this week's portion, because we have the idea of what if the baby has tzaras, this leprosy on their foreskin. So the circumcision overrides the prohibition from the Torah that you're not allowed to remove tzaras. So even on the 8th day. Okay. So let's look at some of the Hasidic discussion over here. That she has to bring. The first thing we should look at is that she has to bring a sin offering. Why is she bringing a sin offering? Okay, hold on 1 second. I see April and Bruce. Okay, so what was the sin of the woman? So there's a lot of theories about what was the sin of that the woman has committed, so much so that she's um, has to bring a sin offering. So there's a lot of different explanations. I just want to cite one, which is from the Shem Mishmuel, which is the Shem Mishmuel says as follows. The Shem Mishmuel is Zakachava Rebbe, and he says, why is she bringing a sin offering? Because of the sin which sin? Why is she bringing it? Anybody want to guess which sin she committed? The sin of listening to the snake and eating from the tree of knowledge. And so therefore, what's this connected? Why is this connected to Chava? Chava is the one who listened to the snake. Why is every woman for all of eternity suffering and having to bring a sin offering? Oh, no. But remember, what was Chava's punishment? What punishment did God give to Eve? He said, Be'etzev te'odi vanim. He said that you're going to give birth with great pain. So Chava was given this curse that she'd have to give birth with pain. And so therefore, the korban is for the woman who gives birth is coming as an atonement that as an atonement for this act of Chava, which is what caused her the pain to begin with. So the Shem Shmuel says that the sin of Eve was double. It was a sin of thought. She, in her mind, she was challenging the words of God, and also, and that she believed the snake. She trusted the snake over God. That was the first sin, but that was a sin of thought, and also the sin of action that she ate from the tree. And so, therefore, she brings two offerings. The Olah is generally speaking a total burnt offering, which atones for sins of thought, like on Yom Kippur, the Hirurei Alev, inner thoughts, the Olah atones for, and also a sin of action. So in this case, the woman has not sinned at all, this specific woman, but woman as a concept has committed the early sin of taking from the tree, believing the snake and taking from the tree of knowledge, and that's what she has to bring the offering for. Okay, so now we go to the next point, which is, why is this one of the only 3 times in the Torah where there's a variable offering? That if she's wealthy, she brings a sheep and a bird, and if she's poor, she brings 2 birds. So here we go to the Sefer Korban Ha'ani, and he writes as follows: the Korban of the poor. This is the Korban of the poor. The woman has the ability to bring the Olav Yored. So he says, if we look at these verses, the verses are a little bit out of order, meaning to say, it should have written, because if you look at the verses, the way it writes is, it says, you bring the sacrifice, and verse 6, you shall make the offering before God, and you bring the sacrifices. This is the law of the woman who gives birth. And then afterwards it says, and if she can't afford it, she can bring this. It should have said that before, this is the law of the woman who gives birth, meaning to say it should have included both types, but rather it gives the offering of the wealthy woman, and then it says, this is the law of the woman who gives birth, and only afterwards does it say, and here is a woman who can't afford it. It should have said this, Zos Torah Yoledes, only at the end of it. So Rashi, in his commentary to Deuteronomy 15:4, says, it says in the Torah, you will not have any poor who will be living amongst you. So what does that mean? And then it states, it states also in Deuteronomy that there will never stop being poor who live amongst you. So how do we understand this? So if people do the will of God, the other people around them, not the Jewish people, will be poor. But when the Jewish people do the will of God, then they won't be poor. But when they don't do it, they'll be the poor ones. And so therefore, when the Jewish people do the will of Hashem, if you follow the Torah, you will never be poor. That's the idea. And so therefore, every woman will be bringing the wealthy person's offering. And so therefore, this is what it really needs to be. It really needs to be that everybody will not be poor, but it will only be the poverty if we're not following the laws of the Torah. So that's how the Korban Ha'ani explains this idea. And then one more teaching about this is the Torah of the Yoedis. We have a little bit of a teaching here from the Belzer Rebbe, Reb Shalom of Belz. He said he gave a drasha on Parashas Tazria Mitzorah, and it was prior to Kiddush. And he began to daven that everybody should be wealthy. So why? They were wondering, why do you want everybody to have money? Doesn't it say in Chagiga that it's good to be poor because you're humble? So why was he praying for wealth? So he says there's a proof from our verse in the Torah. What's the proof? Because it says Isha ki Tazria v'yolda. If she gives birth, if she conceives and she gives birth, she should bring a sheep as an offering. And then it says this is the law of the Yoedis, and only afterwards does it say if you can't afford it, you bring it. And so again, we have the same point. Why does the Torah interfere? It should say Zos Torah Sayoedes even after the poor one. So the reason is that generally speaking, the way of the Torah is that everybody should be able to afford. That's the baseline. So if you're following the laws properly, you'll be able to afford. So it's only when the Jewish people are deviating, that's the concept. You see that already they're talking about here. I mean, obviously there are plenty of poor people who are the biggest tzaddikim in the world, but a lot of times when the rabbis are poor, it's because they want to be poor. They're afraid of what could happen if they become wealthy. They're afraid of what wealth will do to them. It'll make them softer. It'll distract them from their spiritual mission, and so therefore they don't pursue it. Okay, so let's just do one more teaching here about this. So let's go to the Noam Elimelech on this. Let's end with the Noam Elimelech, Rabbi Elimelech of Lezhensk. So it says in the verse that before she brings the sacrifice, before the 80 days are up, she can't touch anything that's sacred. She can't come to the temple until she completes her days of tahara, her days of purity. So says Rabbi Elimelech, when the temple was standing, the divine presence was resting on the Beis HaMikdash. But then in Ezekiel it says in Ezekiel that he lahem mikdashmat, I will be for them, for a mini temple. Meaning to say that at the time of the Beis HaMikdash, God's presence rested on the temple. But without the Beis HaMikdash, where does God's presence rest? So Rabbi Elimelech says it will rest on the tzaddik, on the truly righteous, the limited few who are truly righteous in every generation. But, says Rabbi Elimelech, don't assume for yourself that you are at that level of holiness. Nobody should ever think that they are the tzaddik until until your days of purity are completed. What does that mean? It says in Noam Elimelech, until you are done with all the sweat of life, meaning say, as long as you're alive, which is when you're tahor, don't think that you have the divine presence resting on you. You should always try to work and improve. Meaning to say, The Kedusha will only come after you've gone through life, after you've gone through complete life of working every day to come better. So again, let me just summarize what Rabbi Melech says. He says, what is this idea that it says in the verse that she can't come to holiness until she completes her days of purity? And Rabbi Melech says that this is a lesson for all of us, that when is the body pure? When we're alive. When is the body impure? When we're dead. But he's saying that you cannot come to a state of complete holiness while you're alive, until those days are completed, because our life is about improving. Dead is not improving, although some people do better dead than alive, but most of us, the dead is not improving. So that's how he reads this pasuk in a very spiritual manner. You're not completely holy while you're alive. Always work to improve. Okay, this is good to be back. This is our teachings for today. And Baruch